welcome. I'm Erin Sweeney, and along with Ian Jensen and Lance Langdon, we are this year's Graduate Clothing Committee. We are really pleased to see all of you here. Welcome to our second and final talk of the year, The Conscience of Corporation, Citizens United, the Disney-Pixar merger, and the assertion of cultural authorship by Professor Jerry Christiansen. Firstly, I'd like to thank my fellow convene members who have made this job really a pleasure with their graciousness and organization. And I'd also like to thank the English department staff for helping us work out the logistical details to make this talk come together. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'd like to thank our two outstanding speakers this year, Dr. Radhakrishnan and also Dr. Christiansen, for agreeing to share their time and thoughts with us. So a bit about Jerry. He has spent quite a bit of time on the other coast before coming over here to the sunnier side of the U.S. After receiving his doctorate at Cornell, he taught at Purdue, SUNY Stony Brook, Johns Hopkins, before becoming department chair at Vanderbilt. He came to Irvine in 2003 as the department chair, and we've been lucky enough to have him here ever since. He's the author of Romanticism at the End of History, Lord Byron's Strength, Romantic Writing in Commercial Society, Practicing Enlightenment, Hume and the Formation of a Literary Career, and Coleridge's Blessed Machine of Language. And Jerry is a double threat, if you didn't know this. Both a romanticist and a long-standing film scholar. The talk we're about to hear is, I believe, coming from his forthcoming book, America's Corporate Art Studio Authorship of Hollywood Motion Pictures, which is coming out from Stanford Youth Press at some point in the future. So I was particularly thrilled when Jerry agreed to present this talk because I've had the pleasure of taking his Hollywood and the Modern Corporation graduate seminar. Of course, it started with the jazz singer who made stops along the way at Little Caesar, Gold Diggers in 1933, Such a Wonderful Life, Singing in the Rain, Breathless, Vertigo, Bonnie and Clyde, and ended up with AI and The Truman Show. I plan to fill the end of this introduction with a selection of charming anecdotes about Jerry from my time in this class. But I realized that these were sort of you-had-to-be-here moments, most of which sprang from the tremendous associative web he draws around each film he teaches, and I see people who have taken the seminar are smiling along with me. So instead of trying to recreate these standout moments, I will let him present another one for you. And so, without further ado, Jerry Christiansen.
Just throw this away. Thank you. Thanks to Graduate Student Colloquium and particularly the triad of movers and shakers who've moved and shaken me and gotten me here. And I want to thank them for the opportunity to read what is the last chapter of my book, and also thank you for the merchandising opportunity. I couldn't actually carry out here, but if you want to give me your card at the end of the meeting, I can arrange for a franchise. Seconds of Woody. This is entitled, well, you heard the title. I can't remember what it was because it changed. At the end of Walt Disney's 1939 feature, Pinocchio, an animated artificial person who has demonstrated his capacity to be a money machine to the gypsy impresario Stromboli, becomes, thanks to the intervention of the Blue Fairy, a real boy. In 2006, Pixar, the little company that had proved its capacity to be a money machine to the new Disney CEO Robert Iger, became, thanks to the negotiating skills of Steve Jobs, a real conscience for Walt Disney Productions. That deal would likely not have occurred as it did without Pixar's allegorical reading of Pinocchio's logic of corporate transformation, which is worked out in Toy Story 2 and distilled in the merger contract, is the assertion of Pixar's cultural authorship. As prelude to that story, however, I want to recount another, the tale of how in January 2010, Citizens United, an artificial person that had demonstrated its capacity to produce vicious campaign propaganda, became, thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court, a real citizen. Before I tell any stories, however, I'd like to lay out what I call the studio authorship thesis, which is meant to clarify what I regard as the entailments of adopting an allegorical mode of interpreting Hollywood motion pictures as works of corporate art. There is no interpretation without meaning, no meaning without intention, no intention without an author, no author without a person, No person with greater right to or capacity for authorship than a corporate person. No corporate person who can act without an agent, whether executive board, board of directors, or employee. And finally, an extension that has been formulated to fit the circumstances of the Disney-Pixar deal, which somewhat surprisingly became the telos of this book. The agent of a corporate principle may be its culture, which functions as the conscience of the corporation. I should say that the title, Conscience of a Corporation, is a revision of what has been probably one of the 2 or 3 most important books behind the project, which is Peter F. Drucker's The Concept of a Corporation from 1946. So this is an attempt to end a certain kind of post-war period in 2006. That a corporation could actually intend to create Batman or Grand Hotel would not be such a difficult sell were there not a certain amount of professional interference from literary theorists committed to preserving creativity for individuals, or conversely to denying the esemplastic power to any persons at all. Corporate lawyers have generally cooperated with those theorists, since it's generally been in their interest to cover any tracks that would make a corporation's intention legible, and for good reason. Intent has figured prominently in corporate case law since the early 20th century in 2 related juridical areas: prosecutions for violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act and indictments of corporations for criminal liability. Most of the work I've done regarding studio intention has been pursued under the canopy of antitrust for the historical reason that a government breakup of classical Hollywood's vertically integrated oligopoly had been threatened from the early days of the studio system in the 1920s until the Supreme Court mandated the divorce of production from exhibition in 1948. Evidence of a general or specific intent to monopolize has long been established as sufficient for conviction under Section 2 of the Sherman Act, although what kind of evidence as to intent actually counts has, of course, been vigorously disputed. In this section of the paper, I'll talk a little about the problem of proving corporate criminal intent and connect that problem to the decision for the plaintiff by the U.S. Supreme Court in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission in January of 2010. Proving criminal intent has been difficult because assigning liability for crimes other than those involving strict liability or negligence depends on evidence of mens rea, or a guilty mind. And few jurists have been convinced that the corporation as such is in possession of the subjective capacity to apprehend guilt. Peter French has argued that a corporation's capacity to select the right course of action over a wrong one is enabled by what he calls the corporate internal decision structure, or CID. It's just basically that graph of all of the branching graph of all of the hierarchical relations of authority within the corporation. That CID distributes decisions throughout the executive hierarchy so that the corporation can pursue its strategic objectives without lodging ultimate authority in any individual. And that's true. But nonetheless, behaving illegally is not the same as knowing right from wrong. In the 1990s, culture became the shibboleth of activists, especially in the Commonwealth nations, who aimed to identify a non-individualized corporate subjectivity with a sense of right and wrong. Accordingly, in 1995, the Australian Criminal Code was radically revised to enable prosecutions of corporations for fostering a criminogenic culture, which may have caused the offense to occur, either because the offense was actually directed or because the nature of the culture led to its commission. 2 premises are shared by the moral argument of the culturalist legal movement and my own construction of studio authorship. First, that a corporation considered as an organization is irreducible to a group of biological individuals. 2, considered as a person, the corporation is irreducible to a single biological individual, and therefore cannot be expected to have the same psychic makeup. Consequently, a positive criminal act committed by a corporation equivalent to an act by an individual with mens rea could be accepted as evidence of liability for a crime without adverting to the mental state of the corporation. converse has received little attention, however. For the sheer positive act of committing a crime that looks like a crime equivalent to the crime of an individual, if the sheer positive act, without reference to a mental state, is sufficient for the conviction of a corporation, why could it not be sufficient for any person? It would seem to follow from the logic of the culturalist theory, as from the logic of the evolution of the corporate form, that people, who are persons, are not reducible to biological individuals any more than corporate entities are. The U.S. Supreme Court endorsed that logic of equivalence between corporations and people in January 2010 by ruling for the plaintiff in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, which overruled the court's recent decision in Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, which had upheld the Election Commission's rule prohibiting electioneering by corporations within 30 days of a primary for election to a federal office. The Roberts Court, as well known, extended full First Amendment rights to both nonprofit and profit-making corporations on the grounds that the First Amendment protects political speech and that speech is speech, regardless of the identity of the speaker. An important, if implicit corollary of that decision is the court's confirmation that there is no constitutional distinction between political speech and commercial speech, and therefore none between speech and money. The superficial plausibility of the court's argument depends on a calculated inconsistency. Sometimes it calls corporations persons, sometimes speakers, sometimes citizens. Its synonyms for speech veer from funding to facts to opinions and views. In his forceful dissent to the majority opinion, Justice John Paul Stevens states that it is an interesting question who is even speaking when a business corporation places an advertisement that endorses or attacks a particular candidate. End quote. After eliminating various possibilities, including the shareholders, the directors of the corporation, and its employees, he concludes that if you take away the ability to use general treasury funds for some of those ads, no one's autonomy, dignity, or political equality has been impinged upon in the least. No harm to an individual, no foul on the corporation. Stevens' question regarding the source of corporate speech departs from Foucault's rhetorical question, which asks, rhetorically, what does it matter who is speaking? For Stevens, it does matter. For Kennedy, Roberts, Scalise, Thomas, and Alito, it does not. Foucault called that indifference ethical. But the Roberts Court calls it political. For it doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter who is speaking, then the corporation will speak for all. Let's get back to the movies. Apart from the infamous Hillary documentary, which provoked the suit, this court's single concrete example of how corporate speaking works introduces the final clinching section of the court's opinion. When word concerning the plot of the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington reached the circles of government, some officials sought by persuasion to discourage its distribution. Under Austin, though, the case that had been overruled on behalf of Citizens United, under Austin, though, officials could have done more than discourage its distribution. They could have banned the film. After all, it, like Hillary, was speech funded by a corporation that was critical of members of Congress. Funded by a corporation that was critical. What difference that makes. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington may be fiction and caricature, but fiction and caricature can be a powerful force. Something for the humanists there. I greeted this judicial confirmation of the studio authorship thesis with jubilation, somewhat darkened by my own mens rea, which may be guilt by association or just usual garden variety guilt. I began to feel better, however, when I noticed in this brief foray into film history, the majority opinion manages to distort just about every fact it blithely mentions. We know that because the industrious clerks supply citations. In fact, Frank Nugent, film reviewer for the New York Times, reported in October of 1939 that it was an author of a trade journal, offended by Mr. Smith's scornful representation of the U.S. Senate, who lobbied for the retaliatory passage of the